tell you, when Monica and I were in London, and by the way, before I get started, thank you very much to Mark Jordan and Barry Bovary for filling in a couple Sundays recently. They do such a great job. We have so many talented people here. And but when Mark was filling in, we were in London. We told you that a couple weeks ago. And so we were in the Windsor Castle, and we were walking around one of these rooms, and all of a sudden everybody was rushing to the windows. And I'm like, what is going on here? And so, well, it turned out that the British flag was up at Windsor Castle, which meant that King Charles and Camilla were there. And so I guess a bunch of kind of black state cars pulled up, and everybody was rushing to see if they could see King Charles or Queen Camilla. So I ran over there, but there was a big crowd, and I got up on my tiptoes. I was really wishing I was 6 foot instead of 5'8". And I'm telling you, I've never stood for so long on my tiptoes at one time. I think my calves ached for about a week after that. It was a great workout. And a couple times we saw some ladies come out with these big hats, but I couldn't tell if it was Camilla, and no one else seemed to know. And the best I could figure is I got that great calf workout, and we never saw King Charles or Queen Camilla. I don't know who was coming out of there. But, you know, it was interesting how everybody in that castle rushed to all the available windows to try and see him. You know, one of the interesting things about the book of Esther is the word Yahweh is never mentioned. The name for God is not mentioned in Esther. However, I think as we look at Esther today, you won't have to stand very tall on your tiptoes to see God, because he's all throughout the book. We don't know who wrote it. It's possible that her older cousin Mordecai wrote it. But we're going to look at the way God shows up and the way that these game changers, because they changed the game, they changed the course of history, and we're going to look at how they did it because they were able to have faith in God and see God and what was going on around them. Now, I want to give you just a quick historical context before I run into this, begin studying Esther. And if you don't understand the history of the Old Testament, you ought to get online and study it. It's not that difficult, really. It may seem a little overwhelming at first, but it's not as difficult as you might think. Barry talked about David and Jonathan last week. And of course, after Saul was killed and Jonathan as well, then David became king, and after him Solomon, and then Solomon's son Rehoboam, and the kingdom divided, and Jeroboam took the 10 northern tribes, and Rehoboam had Judah and Benjamin. And after that time, Israel quit following God. And so last week, a couple weeks ago, Mark Jordan talked about Jonah, the fishtail. Well, Jonah had the unenviable task of going and preaching to Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria, and he probably did that somewhere around 750 BC, and he didn't want to go for good reason, because when they repented, somewhere around 27 years later, Assyria came down and conquered most of northern Israel and some of the cities in Judah as well. And of course, after Assyria, the next major empire is Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar took 3 different invasions down into Israel and eventually destroyed Jerusalem. By the way, you can read about all 3 of those in the Bible. And not only that, but there is historical and archaeological evidence of those. In fact, if you look at that little tablet right there on the left. So I've been teaching about archaeological evidences for many years. And I show pictures of all sorts of archaeological evidences like these. And one of the things I enjoyed most when I went to London is I went to the British Museum, because many of the archaeological evidences that I show when I teach archaeological evidences are at the British Museum. So I got a map out and studied where it all was. And these are my pictures from the British Museum. And that little tablet on the left, and by the way, I'd never seen them before with my own eyes. So I would always show like this cylinder right here, and I thought it was this big. Well, y'all, it would fit in my hand. And so it helps to actually see it. And what was amazing, though, is you look at the intricacy. I wonder what instrument they used to write all this history. But did you know on that tablet on the left, Nebuchadnezzar tells about 3 different invasions where he went down into Judah, and finally he conquered and destroyed Jerusalem in about 586, 587 BC. But in his first invasion, he took a whole lot of people out of Judah and took them captive and took them back to Babylon, dispersed them in other lands. And he would take the educated and the smart people, because his theory was if we remove their leaders, they can't rebel or revolt. And so that's how Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego ended up in Babylon. And that's the story of Daniel. They were removed on that first invasion and taken there. But then if you read the book of Daniel, you'll see that he predicted the next few major empires. But he also was there in the palace when the Medes and the Persians came and destroyed Babylon. That's going to be the next empire. It's also going to be when Esther was written. So we're getting to Esther. But an interesting thing, and then we'll get on to the story, is in Daniel chapter 5, it says that Belshazzar was the king of Babylon when it was destroyed by the Medes and the Persians. Well, guess what? For many, many, many years, historians would say, well, that just shows that the Bible's made up because there is no King Belshazzar. Well, this cylinder here on the right, and I got to take a picture of it, is called the Nabonidus cylinder. That's who everyone thought was the last king of Babylon before it fell. And in this, he tells that he went off to do some building outside of Babylon and left his son, here it comes, Belshazzar, in charge of the kingdom. So both of these prove some of the history of the Bible. So after Babylon, Cyrus conquers actually Babylon, and he becomes the king of Persia. And in 536 BC, he tells people that were exiled that they can go home. He says, go on back home. And by the way, in Isaiah chapter 45, about 150 years before this happens, God calls Cyrus out by name. And he says, I'm going to raise up Cyrus as my own to send my people home. And so it's a fulfillment of prophecy. There's so much that in the Bible that is prophetic, and so much of the history that can be proven, not all of it. Now, Ruth is a little bit more difficult because she's under what most people think is Xerxes the first. Ahasuerus is the Hebrew name we're going to find out here in a second for Xerxes I. And they don't have most of that history. Some of the Greeks write about him, but all these tablets and inscriptions they have for the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire don't exist for the Persian Empire, so it's hard to find all this. Now, so that brings us to about 480 BC. So here's what happened. When Cyrus said they could all go home, not everybody went home. Now, who did go home was Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel went back and rebuilt the temple. We learned that from Ezra. But Ezra and Nehemiah hadn't gone yet. They were still in Persia. In fact, Nehemiah, we'll find later, worked for one of the Persian kings. And so this is before either Nehemiah or Ezra went back, is the story of Esther. And so many of the Jews stayed, and here's why. They brought the bright ones, the intelligent ones, and they were educated, and many of them started businesses or even worked in the palace, and they had a lot of money and land, and it was difficult for them to think about giving all that back and going back to the destruction in Judah, so they stayed. And so that brings us to the story of Esther. And I'm going to read some of this and tell you some of the story because it's a long one. In Esther chapter 1, it says, now in the days of Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, and this is who we believe is Xerxes the first. In those days when the king sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the splendor and the riches of his royal glory and the pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. So he has this huge exhibition and invites all the leaders of his army and his nobles and governors and says, I want you to come see all the riches of my empire for 180 days. That was a pretty long exhibition. At the end of it, he decides to have this 7-day party. And it says that they all drank, and they could drink as much as they wanted to, and that when he was merry with wine, that he said, I want y'all to go get Vashti, the queen, and tell her to come because I want them to see how beautiful my wife is. So in a sort of merry stupor, he sends for his wife, and she says, I'm not coming. I'm not going to go hang out with a bunch of drunk men, including you. Well, that made him really angry. And so the Bible story goes on to say that, he called his wise men and said, what am I going to do about this? She won't even obey the king, her husband. And they said, well, this can't happen. We're going to have a women's liberation movement a couple thousand years too early. We're going to have to stop this in its tracks. And they basically say that. No one will ever obey their husband again. And so he says, well, I'm going to make a law that she's banished from the throne. She can't come back. And then they said, well, what you need to do then is you need to bring all these virgins and pick a new queen. And so that's what he did. Josephus, who must have had access to some documents that we don't, some of the Greek historians also did, because those have been lost, says that 400 virgins were brought to the palace. And so that brings us to Mordecai and Esther. And Mordecai is her older cousin. In chapter 2, verse 5, it says, now, there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away from Jeconiah, king of Judah. And I notice he's the son of Kish, so he's related to Saul, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. And so his family, like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, had been taken away back during the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And they stayed in the land. And he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. So Esther was an orphan. And the young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. When her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put into the custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. We can go on here in verse 9 and say that she quickly gained his favor. She advanced in the harem. And then in verse 10, it's going to say that also she kept secret that she was a Jew on the advice of her cousin Mordecai. And so she wasn't letting anybody know about that. And that's because even back then, there was already a lot of anti-Semitism. Isn't it interesting that all these years later, there's still a good amount of anti-Semitism in the world? And we may address that here in a little while. And so then in verse 17, here's what we find out happens. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. What an amazing rise from an unknown, poor Jewish orphan to now she's the queen of Assyria. Of the Medes and the Persians. Now, just a quick comment as we walk through this. When you look through these game changers in the Bible, do y'all remember what Gideon was? He was a farmer. We haven't talked about Amos. Anybody know what Amos was? He wrote a book. We consider him a prophet, but he says in his own book, I'm no prophet. I'm a sheep herder. But God grabbed me and told me things, and I have to respond. And I think about Esther. She was an orphan. I think about the followers of Jesus. He got about a bunch of uneducated fishermen to follow him. And so as we look at this story, I just want us to remember that don't let anybody tell you you're unimportant in the kingdom of God. And you may say, well, I'm not going to be Esther. I'm not going to be queen. I'm not going to write a book like Amos. No, but he writes this and tells us these stories because we're in a part of this battle between good and evil, and God wants to use us for good. And this is what we're going to find out, is there's a battle going on. And so now that we have the king and Esther, who's the new queen, and her uncle Mordecai, we have the antagonist, which is Haman. And in chapter 3, verse 1, it says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded it concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Now, I don't know why Mordecai didn't do it. It may be the same reason that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down and worship the image Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Or it may be the same reason that Daniel, who was already passed away but preceded him, refused to quit praying to God, because they had made an edict that for 30 days you could only pray to Nebuchadnezzar. But he went every day and prayed in the morning, and then they used that to try and get him. But he refused to pray to him, and it infuriates Mordecai. And he asked about him. They said he's a Jew. Well, here's what you need to know. It says here that Haman is an Agagite. Well, in 1 Samuel 15, Agag, who is way back in his lineage, was the king of the Amalekites. And Saul conquered the Amalekites and refused to kill Agag like God told him to. And if you remember the story, Samuel comes up and says, why didn't you kill the king? He said, well, I killed everybody else. And he said, you were told to kill the king. And Samuel kills Agag, hacks him. And for some reason, this enmity between the descendants of the Amalekites continues to this day. When he found out he was a Jew, and in the lineage of Saul, he may not have known that, he thought, I want to kill all these Jews. I'm so angry. And he went home, and they all conspired with him, and they cast lots. In Hebrew, the word is pure for lots, and it fell to December, or the 12th month. It was actually Adar. Who knows what month that was to us, but it would be our month of December. And in the month of Adar, they were going to kill all the Jews, and he hatched this plan, and he went to the king, and he said, listen, there's a group of people out here that hate the king. They don't follow the laws. They don't bow down if you tell them to. They're rebellious, and we need to get rid of them. Not only that, they have quite a bit of money. And he says, I tell you what, if you give me permission to kill all of them, and you make an edict, and the edict of the king can't be reversed, then I'll kill them all in the 12th month, and I'll bring 10,000 talents of silver back, and I'm going to lay it here, right here in the king's treasury. And he said, well, that sounds good to me. I don't like rebellious people, and I like money. So he signed the order, and there it was. All the Jews were supposed to be killed. Now, just so you know, this is more than just the hatred between the Amalekites and the Jews that's at play here. This is more than the battle between Haman and Mordecai. Satan is at work here. Satan is trying to destroy the Jews that he knows God intends on using. He doesn't know how he's going to use them. And you may think, are you sure about that? Yeah, well, think about Matthew chapter 2, when the wise men came to Herod and told Herod about the Messiah. And then he realized that they had tricked him and didn't come back to tell him where he was. He killed all the babies under 2 years old. That's what Satan does. He destroys people, and he's doing everything he can. Or think about Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4, Satan comes to Jesus and does everything he can to tempt him. He wants to unravel and sidetrack God's plan, and he offers him all these earthly thrones if he'll just renounce God and follow Satan. Or even Matthew 16. Amazingly, right after Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ and the Lord and the Son of God, shortly after that, Jesus explains to his disciples that he's going to have to die and he'll be buried for 3 days. Now, they don't understand all this yet. They don't understand he's going to be raised. And y'all remember what Peter said? He pulls him aside and says, hey, Jesus, this is a bad plan. We can't do this. You're the Son of God. You're not going to die. And do you remember what he says? He says, Satan, get behind me. And so, I don't know what's going on in your life. I know what's going on in mine. And Satan is always battling against us. And, you may be struggling in your marriage. Well, that's partly Satan's work. You may be struggling at work, or your family may have struggles. Well, trust me, Satan will get in the middle of that and do damage if he can. He'll try and pull you away from God. And we have to decide whose side we're on. We have to decide how we're going to encounter life, how we're going to navigate these problems that come into our life. And so we're going to learn just three quick points about how you can do this from the story of Esther. The first one is starting in Esther chapter 4 and verse 1. So when Mordecai learned that all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. And he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. And he went up to the entrance of the king's gate. Now he worked around the king's gate. And he went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. So he stayed outside. He could go in normally. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. Now, that's kind of a weird game changer practice to mourn. That's not how our society teaches most people to deal with sadness. Do something that makes you happy. Take some pills. Have a drink. Don't be sad, but the Bible teaches that mourning is actually a part of what we have to go through. And Jesus himself in Matthew chapter 5, verse 4 says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Now, oftentimes science and medicine confirm things that even the Bible says. Now, if it doesn't, it may be bad medicine and bad science, or maybe someone's misunderstood the Bible, but the Bible's pretty clear in multiple places that the ability to mourn, the need to mourn, the actual practice of mourning is healthy for you. And medical science has learned that people that don't deal with their grief, that don't get it out, have mental problems. They sink into depression. They have medical problems. If you're depressed long enough and unhappy long enough, you'll have physical manifestations of that. Now, okay, so I need to mourn. What should I mourn? Well, if I read the Bible and understand it right, let me tell you some things we should mourn in our life. I mourn sin in my life, and I mourn sin in the lives of people I care about. That brings me to tears because my heart's breaking for God. I want to have God's heart. He doesn't want us to be calloused and not care. I grieve for injustice in the world. I remember as a kid that I used to look around and think, this is so sad that people are growing up and they don't have the same opportunity I have to learn about Jesus. I pray for people like that. I was so glad my dad became a missionary because his goal was to share Jesus with the world. But we're supposed to work through this. You grieve when you have a loss of someone you love or a loss of a dream. You grieve for many reasons. A loss of a physical capability. Those things cause us to grieve, and we're meant to grieve. And in fact, now you're not meant to live in grief all your life, no. You have to grieve, but as a part of this process of grieving, we're comforted as we learn to give it over to God, right? God's the one that comforts us. And so he models for us the need to mourn in our lives. And we need to recapture that. We've developed hard hearts because we're comfortable, we're wealthy. We don't want to be tearful, but God wants us to break our heart in the same way that his heart breaks. And so now Esther hears he's mourning, and she says, she gets Hathach, which is a eunuch that was one of her attendants, and says, you need to go find out what's going on with Mordecai. And so he went and he told Esther about this edict to destroy all the Jews and says, you need to go to the king and save us. And so this is all in chapter 4. And she says, well, I can't do that. And she sends Hathach back and says, well, he might kill me. You're not allowed to go in front of the king without an invitation. I haven't been in front of him in 30 days, so I don't know if I'm kind of out of his good graces or what, but I can't go till he calls me. And so then Mordecai sends back with this message, and he says in chapter 4, verse 13, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you'll escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And so one of the things that we need to think about today is I have come to this particular time and place in my life for what sort of task from God? What is his calling for me today? So we mourn the lack of direction, we mourn the loss, but then we turn to God, and that's exactly what she's going to do. So she responds to him in verse 15, well, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my young women will also fast as you do. Now, you know, we don't fast very often. In fact, I have an anti-fasting sort of obsession right now. I went to London. I thought, well, I'm not going to fast in London. And I went to my family reunion. Thought, I'm not going to fast my reunion. And I'm home, and I don't plan on fasting at home. But maybe I need to change that. And the Bible talks a lot about fasting. Jesus fasted. Now, don't fast to lose weight. That's not what he's talking about here. And that can be dangerous for some people. But there's something about fasting that even neurology has figured out. And they say that when you fast for a little while, that it releases a protein called BDNF. Now, you know, that's a weird initial there. But it's some sort of brain derivative neurotrophic factor. I can't even believe I remembered the name. But that's what it is. And they say when that releases in your brain that, guess what? You have more clarity. It says that things are easier to learn. Now, you know, some people do this just so they can follow the God of themselves. They fast so they can have more mental clarity. And there's a lot of CEOs that talk about how fasting helps them become richer. But people, we're not talking about fasting to get more of what I want in my life. We're talking about fasting to get closer to God in our life. In Psalm chapter 10, verse 4, it says that the pride of a wicked man keeps him from seeking God. When we're obsessed with ourselves and we're obsessed with what we want, what we think we need, and what we want to do, it keeps us from seeking God. And it goes on to say that in all his thoughts, he doesn't have room for God. And we sometimes need to fast because we're so busy, we just don't have room for God. Yesterday, Monica ran and got some groceries, and she was driving in our 2017 Honda Accord. And you know, we have this little screen up there, and our CarPlay pays there, and we weren't really using it, but I was kind of looking at that screen, and I saw this little message flip through real quick, and it said low oil pressure. I thought, well, that doesn't look good. And so we looked over here at the speedometer, and there's a light that's supposed to go on with low oil pressure. Well, that wasn't on. Well, I don't know whether to believe that or not. And so I got out my phone and started researching and said, well, it could be that message is correct, and it just didn't send the signal to turn that other light on. And I'd never been in there before, but I went in there and found Honda Link and looked, and sure enough, that message was there. And she said, should I pull over? I said, I don't know. The engine's purring pretty good. Let's just go on home. We're almost home. So we got home, and we stopped, and I let it cool down for about an hour and went back out there and pulled the oil stick off and looked pretty dry. And I thought, well, I cleaned it, put it back in there. There wasn't a drip of oil on that oil stick. But man, this doesn't look good. So I went to AutoZone and got some oil. I asked him what all could have happened. He gave me all these suggestions. And so I went back, and for those of you who know cars, I don't that well, but I had to learn this one. I went back and looked at my coolant reservoir, and it looked like it was full of oil. That's not a good sign. So apparently I blew a head gasket. Now, I'm thinking, first, we were going to go to Baton Rouge for our family reunion in our car. And at the last second, we decided to fly. Thank God for that. I'd probably still be there. And Brian, if he wasn't in the hospital, would have to come pick me up. I mean, that's probably what would have happened. But thank God I saw that message. And I'm really mad because it should have popped up on my little dashboard. But I'm glad I noticed it. People, don't miss God's message in your life. I got lucky. You don't want to get lucky with God. That means you have to take time to fast and pray and read the Bible and let God in. And so they mourned, and then they sought God. They made room for God in their life. And then that leads us to the last point, which is, and here's what she says. So she says, you fast, we'll fast. And then the end of verse 16, then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Now, this is an amazing story. And most of you know what I know. And if you've forgotten it, I'm going to run through it real quick. But so she went to the king, stood in the corner. He raised the signet, told her she could come. She went and touched it. He said, what do you want? You can have up to half the kingdom. She's thinking, thank God he still loves me. That's a good sign. And she says, I just want a banquet with Haman. And so the next night, there's this big banquet, and they invite Haman, but nothing goes on. And Haman's so excited, he thinks, I'm the only one that was with the king and queen. Things are going pretty good in my life. And he goes out, and when he goes out, he sees Mordecai, that Jew that's still grieving, and just the irritation won't bow down to him. He goes and tells his family, here I am. And the Bible says he recounted all of his wealth and how many sons he had, and told them how exalted he was in front of the king and queen. And he said, here's this Mordecai. And they said, you just need to kill him. So go ahead and build some gallows. And when you go to the next banquet tomorrow night, because Esther invited back for a second night, just tell the king you want him killed. So meanwhile, during the night in chapter 6, the king's sleeping and he can't sleep. And so he asks one of his attendants to bring him the Chronicles of History so he could read through it. So I skipped through this. But in Esther chapter 2, at the very end of it, Mordecai, Esther's cousin who worked at the gates, heard a plot to kill the king and sent it to Esther, who sent it to the king, and they wrote it down in the Chronicles. It always pays to do what's right, by the way. And God will use that to bless your life and sometimes to save you later on down the road. Always do what's right. But so what happens is he's having them read these Chronicles, and he reads about how Mordecai saved his life by giving him this inside information about a coup that he had overheard. And he said, have we ever done anything to honor them? He said, no. And he said, well, who's in the palace right now? He said, well, just your right-hand man, Haman. We'll bring him in here. And Haman went in and he said, Haman, what should I do to somebody I really like who deserves to be honored in a way they've never been honored before? And Haman's thinking, boy, things are going pretty good for me. I'm going to get honored again. And he said, well, get some robes that the king wore, and get a crown that the king wore, and then also a horse that the king rode on, and just have him go around the square and everybody honor him. And he said, go get Mordecai and bring him in here, and you do that for him. What a reversal. And so then he goes home, and his family says, this is not a good sign, buddy. You're in trouble. If he's a Jew, they weren't even sure, but if he's a Jew, you're in trouble. So he went to the second banquet, and the king asked Esther, what do you want? And she said, I just want you to spare me and my people from death. And she said, who is the wicked man that would kill all of you? And she said it was Haman. And they put him to death. And he was hung on the gallows that he built to hang Mordecai. God reversed it all. Now, you know, I was doing some research for this sermon, and I was looking for a real life illustration about fasting. And so I've been using ChatGPT sometimes lately, and it comes up with some great stories. And so I asked, what's a good example of someone who fasted and solved a problem in their life by fasting? So it gave me the story of George Washington Carver. And so he lived in the middle 1800s to about the middle 1900s, and he was an African-American agriculturalist and inventor. And he went and helped them sort of refurbish the ground in the South that had been depleted because of cotton farming. And so he came up with all these new crops they could plant. He did a great job. And so ChatGPT said that one of his secrets is that he reported that he'd go out in the woods and pray and fast, and that after he finished praying and fasting, these ideas would come to him. Well, I always check everything out. So I went on the internet, I couldn't find that. And so I went back to ChatGPT, and I said, well, I can't confirm that George Washington Carver ever said he fasted. Where'd you get that information? Listen to what he said back to me. Well, you're absolutely right. There's no reliable historical evidence that George Washington Carver ever engaged in fasting as a means to inspire his scientific breakthroughs. Well, that's what he just told me he did. He says, my earlier statement was an error, and I appreciate you challenging it. Yes, I got ChatGPT lying to me. Now, tell you all that because I tell you this, you're making decisions on what you're going to do in your life, and there's a lot of lies that Satan's going to be putting into your mind. He's going to tell you the way you ought to go, what will make you happy. He's going to tell you that God's way isn't all that important, and I'm telling you, it's nothing but a lie. You better check it out. That's why we're looking at game changers. You want to change your life? Mourn over the things that God mourns over. You want to change your life? Fast and make time for him in your brain, in your heart. Put his word in your mind. Pray. You want to change your life? Take a risk based on what God says. And he will never let you down. Let's stand and sing.